Hi, I'm Megan Talbot. I teach law at Aberystwyth University, and I figured that I would do a talk for you today to explain some things about law. And this is a sort of talk where we will be talking about some concepts which we discuss in first year law. And this might be something you're interested in if you're interested in going to university to study law, or it might just be an interesting story that tells you something about how law works that you end up enjoying. Who knows? And so it took me a bit to figure out what sort of topic I should cover. And then I noticed that the sort of viral videos that, well, not viral videos that get quite popular that talk about quite technical topics tend to be ones about interesting stories. And if you're perhaps this says more about my YouTube suggestions than anything else, but I tend to get recommended a few conference talks about people who use an interesting incident, particularly like a disaster where something went very wrong, to explain a complex topic. So I was thinking, what goes very wrong in law? Well, lots of things go very wrong in law, often on a fairly personal scale. But when has there really been a legal catastrophe? And there have been a few, but one that came to mind first was an interesting example. And it was, wait a minute, didn't Texas ban marriage accidentally in the 2000s? And so I looked it up, as you do, or as you should. And that's the topic of today's talk. And I hope it'll work if I start PowerPoint. I hope this works. I have no way of knowing if this is working. So, the question today on our talk, Bigamy, Balconies, and Accidentally Banning Marriage, is what happened in Texas. So, to set the scene for our story, I draw your minds, paint in your head a mental picture. I take ye to Texas. This is a stock image for Texas, which is where I grew up during a lot of my teen years, in Houston, in 2005. Now, I was in Texas in 2005, and I remember hearing about this on the news. I was eating, I think it was, we had Chinese takeout, and I just finished watching an episode of Kitchen Nightmares, and the news came on after Kitchen Nightmares, as it did at 9 p.m. And they were talking about this. So what was the news talking about? Well, they were talking about how the state of Texas had changed the law. What did they change? Well, they voted to amend the state constitution to ban gay marriage. So gay marriage wasn't legal at that point in Texas, but they wanted to make double super ultra sure it wouldn't be legal. So they voted to ban it as a part of the state constitution. And they amended the constitution to include this section 32, which says marriage in the state shall be only the union of one man and one woman, and this state or a political subdivision of the state, so a county or a city, may not create or recognize any legal status identical or similar to marriage. What's the problem here? Well, in 2009, a candidate for Attorney General, while they're running their campaign, points to a problem in the law. And this problem is the second part, the part that says this state or a political subdivision of the state may not create or recognize any legal status identical to or similar to marriage. And they point out, well, marriage is identical to marriage. So, and in the papers they were quoted as saying you don't have to have a fancy law degree to read this and understand what it plainly says. And, if you read this, and they say, well, you can't create a legal status identical or similar to marriage. Well, marriage is identical to marriage. Oops. So what happened as a result of this? Well, a bunch of papers all ran stories talking about how Texas had accidentally banned all marriages. They were trying to ban gay marriage, but they'd accidentally said we won't recognise anything identical to marriage, and that includes marriage, and they hadn't realised that at the time. So all the papers run these stories about how Texas accidentally bans marriage, and if you were like me and at the time a somewhat smug college student, you would go, oh, if only the state of Texas understood what they were doing. And it was this sort of moment where you got to be pleased that the people in doing this thing, which I politically didn't agree with, had accidentally, shot themselves in the foot. And it was a very satisfying moment. So, the question: did Texas actually accidentally ban all marriages? Well, how do we answer this question? Well, we look to a thing called statutory interpretation. Statutory interpretation is a set of tools and rules that we use when we as lawyers, or as, judges or anyone dealing with the law at all, uses the rules of statutory interpretation to figure out what a piece of legislation means. Why do we need special rules? Why can't you just read the law? Well, because sometimes the English language can be a bit ambiguous or confusing. Take this sentence, for example. I'm not going to read it aloud, you should read it aloud. Right? You may have noticed a problem with this sentence. And it ruins it if I read it aloud, because you initially go, okay, the complex houses, married and single, wait, what's going on? And then you go back. Because complex can be a noun, meaning like a housing complex, or it can be an adjective describing something. So initially we read this and go, okay, the complex houses, well, houses can be a verb, as in to house, or a noun, meaning a building, a house. And so those words cause us a bit of confusion. And this is an example of ambiguity, and it's quite a fun one. It's not from a statute, interestingly enough, but it's an example of how the English language is sort of innately ambiguous. Have these houses married people, or is it a housing complex in which married and single soldiers and their families can live? And legislatures have this additional complication that they have to write rules that function in the way that they want. They do the thing they want. They make the thing they want legal or illegal. But they also need to be understood by most people so that you can follow the law. So they both need to be precise and do what you want, but they also need to be understandable by most people. So, how do you manage this? How do you write a law that most people can understand but also does what you want? Well, the way we start with, and a fairly straightforward way, is to be literal. You always say exactly what you mean. And this seems like it's an easy way to make sure that you're always understood. If you always say exactly what you mean, and you use, dictionary definitions, you'll be fine. But it's not always possible to fully say what you mean. Sometimes what you're getting at is slightly more complex, and I've got some examples. This is one of the great things about the English legal system, or the legal system in the United Kingdom, is that when we have a problem with the law, we go to court and we have case law, and cases help us understand and make legal rules and help us understand what the legal rule is in that situation. It's a system called common law, where the results of real cases shape how we understand the law and how the law is in practice. So we have a case from 1960 called Smith versus Hughes. Parliament wanted to stop prostitutes from soliciting on the street. So this was soliciting is sort of touting for business, so sidling up to people on the street and going, hello, would you fancy a time with a prostitute, young sir / madam / older sir / madam, whatever. You can tell I have no idea how prostitution actually works in practice. But they wanted to ban people from soliciting on the street because it was causing a public nuisance. They didn't want it. So, as a result, the prostitutes went, okay, we're not allowed to solicit on the street anymore. Gotcha. So they started yelling down from balconies. And in a way, they're kind of right. right? Because if you say, well, you can't solicit in a public place, madam, and then she goes, well, I'm not in a public place, I'm on a private balcony. You don't really have anywhere to go if you're being literal, because the law literally just bans soliciting in a private place, and she's not in a private place, a public place. She's in a private place where she can be heard in public. So, did Parliament literally just mean what they literally said? Did Parliament mean to allow people to solicit from balconies? So the court considered this, and they reached the conclusion that when you make a law, you tend to want to fix a problem. In the actual case, they call it a social mischief. Right? There's a problem you want to fix. And if your way of interpreting the law leaves the problem unfixed, your interpretation is probably wrong. So if the problem was they didn't want people being bothered by prostitutes in the street, and then you interpret it literally, so you can still be bothered by prostitutes in the street so long as they're on a private balcony yelling at you, it may not be the best interpretation. This is called the mischief rule. And in the mischief rule, we look at what Parliament was trying to fix. We look for the problem that they were trying to fix, and then we look, okay, does our interpretation fix the problem? And this is, rule is deployed because you can't always say the fullness of what you mean. It wouldn't necessarily have made sense for Parliament to go, well, we want you're not allowed to solicit in a public place. That includes private places where you can be heard in public. It also includes using a radio or anything. If we didn't use things like the mischief rule, that piece of legislation would have been miles long. You can't always say the fullness of what you necessarily mean, but you can trust, using the rule of statutory interpretation, that you will be understood, what you wanted to happen will be understood, and that it will be made to happen. There's another problem with trying to be literal, and this is that people are always trying to be clever, and they're always trying to find a way to get around the law. If you practice law, you may occasionally have a client like this. I certainly have, where people will think, I am the single brain genius in the world, and I have discovered the way where I can avoid following any law ever, and I've read the statute, and this makes sense to me, and I can avoid the consequences of my actions, because I found the loophole. This doesn't necessarily work. Let's talk about why. So, let's look at the case of R.V. Allen. Allen was a bit of a brain genius. He is accused of bigamy. Bigamy is having two wives. He was married and then married another woman. So he argues, bigamy doesn't exist, so you can't find me guilty of it. The court goes, what do you mean? What do you mean bigamy doesn't exist? It's right here in the Offences Against the Person Act. And so Allen says, wait a minute. Well, you see, bigamy is being married to more than one person. But if you read the Matrimonial Causes Act, that says that any marriage after the first one is invalid. It's void. So it doesn't count. So I can't have committed bigamy because my second marriage wasn't legally valid. So it's impossible to commit bigamy because your marriages after the first one are always invalid. So, what does the court do in the face of Allen trying to pull a bit of a fast one here? Well, no, bigamy isn't impossible. But why? Well, the court used something called the Golden Rule. This says that we should start out interpreting the statute literally, because this ensures consistency as much as we can, using the ordinary everyday meaning of the words. What would the normal person understand this to mean? Because ultimately, normal people have to follow the law, so if we're using definitions in the law that normal people don't understand, things might get a bit sticky. But then there's another step. And this is, if your literal interpretation of the law would be absurd, you look for the intention of Parliament. What did Parliament mean to do? So, we can apply this if we go back to Texas. Because in R.V. Allen, he wasn't found... he was found to have committed bigamy. Allen's plan did not work. He was not the single-brain genius because they applied the golden rule, and he was found to be guilty of bigamy. Because they said, look, this is an absurdity. It would be absurd if Parliament said bigamy is illegal, also bigamy is impossible. So because that would be absurd, we're going to look what Parliament meant to do. So let's apply these lessons and go back to Texas. So, did Texas accidentally ban all marriages in 2005? No. But why? Which is always the most important question, right? But why is this the case? Well, we just apply these rules of statutory interpretation. The wording is, this state or political subdivision of the state may not create or recognize any legal status identical or similar to marriage. If we only use the literal rule, we could say, well, literally, marriage is identical to marriage. Things are identical to themselves, right? I was looking around for a prop to use as an example of something that is identical to itself. But you know what an item looks like. What you can imagine a thing, a generic object, which is identical to itself, because everything is identical to itself. So, but we know what the law wanted to do, right? This section in the Act isn't there for no reason. It's there because they didn't just want to ban gay marriage. They also wanted to not have civil unions, which is where you can have a relationship like a marriage, but that isn't called a marriage. They didn't want to do that either. And that's why this part of the law exists. So we know what what the Texas state legislature wanted to do. And we know that if we use the literal rule, it might be a bit absurd to say, oh, well, they've accidentally banned all marriage. So we use the golden rule. Well, we look, is there an absurdity here? Maybe. But we can avoid this by looking at the intent of, okay, well, they clearly wanted to stop civil unions. They clearly didn't intend to ban all marriage, so we'll interpret it this way. So, why does this matter? So what? Why does this matter? So, well, we use the conventions of statutory interpretation all the time to ensure consistency and also avoid absurdities. And this is why it's okay for laws to be a little imprecise, because the rules of statutory interpretation can compensate. Hopefully, this story about, Texas, did they accidentally ban all marriage? No, they didn't. Has helped you understand how the law works a little better, and how lawyers and judges read statutes in practice. So I hope this has been an interesting and useful thing for you. That's the end of this little talk. I hope you've had a happy day, or will have a happy day if you're watching this in the morning, if you're one of those strange and unusual morning people. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I'm going to find a way to end the presentation now. I don't know how to end the presentation. Oh no, what an awkward way to end. Have a happy day.